Hey everybody, in today's video we're going to be talking about the new Nikon Zf. This is a camera that I'm sure is a complete surprise to all of you. Now the Nikon Zf is the full frame retro styled Nikon camera. Nikon obviously released the ZFC not too long ago, but the key thing that a lot of people requested after the launch of the ZFC being DX or APS-C cropped censored camera, the biggest thing that a lot of people requested was a full frame version. So that's what the ZF is. It is that full frame version, that full frame equivalent of the ZFC. Now, a lot of people might have thought that the ZF was just going to be a Z6 II in a different camera body. Just everything on the outside would be different, but everything on the inside would be the same. And that's not the case at all. The ZF borrows a lot of things from the past, especially when it comes to its design and functions and usability, but it also borrows a lot of things from newer technology around the Z8 and the Z9, the processor, the menu system, and there's also a lot of new functions in the ZF that have never been in any Nikon camera before. So when it comes to those main specifications, this does use a 24.5 megapixel backlit CMOS sensor. That is the same sensor that you'll find in the Z6 II. It's also the same shutter mechanism that you'll find in the Z6 II as well. This is not a completely shutterless camera like the Z8 and the Z9 are. This does have a mechanical shutter. You can still use it in electronic shutter if you wanted to, but it's not quite the same as you would find in the Z8 and the Z9. That also means that it does not have a sensor shield. So it just has a mechanical shutter. There's no sensor shield like you would find in the Z8 or the Z9 either. Now, when it comes to the processor of this camera, it does use the XP7 processor, which is what you would find in the Z8 and the Z9. It borrows that same processor. That new XP7 processor allows for an entirely new focusing system. The ZF's focusing system borrows the same subject detection options that you would get in the Z8 and the Z9. So that means that it can detect eyes and faces of humans, animals, vehicles, aeroplanes, birds, whatever you want to point it at. Generally, the ZF will be able to detect that subject and focus on it. If your Z8 or Z9 is able to detect the subject, then your ZF will be able to detect the subject as well. Now, when it comes to those auto-focusing areas, it also shares the same areas as the Z8 and the Z9. We have access to 3D tracking. We also have the same auto area with subject detection, and we also have wide area C1 and C2, the customizable wide area focusing squares. In the Z8 and the Z9, you had up to 20 different variations. In the ZF, you have up to 77 different variations. There's a lot more choice when it comes to choosing the size and the shape of your custom wide area autofocusing area. You can also make use of the subject detection options whilst using manual focus. Now this might sound a bit strange, but you can use the autofocus to tell you where a particular subject is, or just to recognize the eye or a face of a subject. Even though you're predominantly using manual focus, you can still do that at the same time. This is something you've not been able to do in a Nikon camera before. It allows you to make use of that subject detection whilst still being in manual focus if you're manually focusing your lens. See it like a manual focus assist, like another level of focus peaking. The ZF can record up to 4K when it comes to video recording, and it can record 10-bit N-Log internally, which the Z6 II could not do because it had to do that externally to an external recorder. So this is technically Nikon's first mid-range camera that lets you record 10-bit N-Log internally without an external recorder. Previously to that, only the Z8 and the Z9 have been able to do that. When it comes to the design and the tactile nature of these dials, switches, the way that you interact with this camera, similar to the ZFC, is different to how you would interact with a Z8, a Z9, a Z6, and a Z7. And it's either going to be something that you absolutely love, or it's going to be something that you absolutely hate. I personally really enjoy the way that I can interact with these dials, change my settings, adjust them. The sound and the feel of each of these dials is different, and I really like that. So I've generally been using the ZF as my travel and everyday out and about camera just because of how good it is to use. I just enjoy the experience of using it. And that was the same case with the ZFC. I really enjoyed using the ZFC. I took this thing everywhere with me. Even if I already had my bigger Z8 or Z9 with me, I just took this with me in case I wanted to take either some street photography shots or some travel shots. This was just my camera. It was my camera that I could capture my life with. And the ZF is the full frame equivalent of that. I still get the ability to use the dials, the tactile nature. I just really enjoy it. But I appreciate that for some of you out there, you won't, because it's not as convenient as the dials that you would get on a Z6 II or the dials that you would get on a Z8 or a Z9. There are things that maybe do take a little bit longer. The ZF, like the ZFC, is more of a considered camera when it comes to changing the settings, maybe slowing yourself down. It is going to be a design, it is going to be a camera that is going to be more of a love-hate thing, whether you really like the design or whether you don't. If you did want to use it more like the Z6 II and more like the Z8 or the Z9, then you can. You still have a rollable dial on the front and a rollable dial on the rear, so you can still use that to control your settings. You can still make use of most of the settings from in the menu. You do have some flexibility when it comes to customizable buttons. So you can still use this like a normal camera if you wanted to, but this is obviously designed to be used like a traditional film style camera with controls of dials, switches, and so on. Now, I like the design. I'm also so glad that Nikon decided to launch this first camera in black. Obviously, with the ZFC, there was a silver version, which was the first version that launched, but then the black version came later, and I generally prefer the design of the black version, so I'm much happier to find that the ZF is launched in black. So when it comes to the dials across the top of the camera, we have an exposure compensation dial. It's not a locking dial, but there is a very small divot or rivet when you hit 0, and it kind of sits in that divot. And that means that it is a little bit harder to move it away from 0 than it is when you're moving it from +1 to +2, for example. So it does mean that it does stop you from accidentally knocking it, but that might still happen if you do catch it, just something to be aware of. You can also screw in a shutter cable if you wanted to into the shutter inside that on and off switch. We then have our shutter speed dial, and this is a really nice tactile dial. I love the feel of it and the sound of it when changing it as well. And then we have our ISO dial over on that left hand side. Again, that kind of tactile nature and the sound of that dial, I just really enjoy that. We'll come back to these dials later on. Underneath our shutter speed dial, we also have the ability to change between stills, video, and a new black and white mode. So if you wanted to change your ZF into a black and white option, then there's a specific dial to do that. You don't have to go into the camera's menu and change your picture control anymore. You can change that from a dial right on the top of the camera. Particularly useful for those of you that do want to use the ZF in a black and white exclusive mode. You just have a switch specifically dedicated to that. There is one single function button on the front of the camera, and then obviously a lens release button as well. I suppose the only thing that you might find difficult is there isn't many controllable function buttons. There's only this main one on the front here. You can customize some of the other options in the camera, but there's not many things that you can do if you want lots of customizable buttons like you have on the Z8 or the Z9. However, there is an option called touch function. Now, this touch function is something that Nikon used to do in the D5600, and they haven't done since then. I was quite surprised that we never really saw it in anything like the Z30 or even maybe in the ZFC. It would have made sense to have it in those cameras, but it's come back in the ZF. Now, the touch function allows you to customize the touchscreen so that when your camera is to your eye, you can use it like a dial, or you can use it to move your focusing points around. So there's lots of different options that you can assign to your touchscreen when the camera's to your eye. I personally prefer using it to move the focusing point around. Really nice if you're in single point. You just put your thumb on the touchscreen, roll your thumb around, and then that single point will follow wherever you want it to go. The ZF also has a fully articulating screen, so you can point it towards yourself and take pictures of yourself if that's the way that you're inclined. Also, if you want to record yourself, this is a camera that a lot of people could use to record themselves talking to camera if they wanted full frame, 10-bit, 4K, N-Log in camera. The ZF does that, and the Z6 II does not do that. So this kind of steps the game up when it comes to what is possible in a Nikon mid-range camera, especially if you wanted a screen that tilts towards you so you can see yourself whilst you're recording that video. The one thing that I really don't like with the design of this camera is that it still has an AEL, AFL button. I kind of get it that AEL and AFL, auto exposure lock and autofocus locks, have been traditional buttons on older cameras, but I just don't see that needing to be that button anymore. You can obviously customize it to be an AF on button, that's not a problem, but I just would have liked it to have been a dedicated AF on button. And obviously there is no autofocus toggle on the back of this camera like you'll find on the Z6 II and on Z8s and Z9s. However, I do think that the way around that is with touch function, and also because this camera is really good when it's in auto area and just detecting and figuring out where the subject is and figuring out where the camera needs to focus. The need for an AF toggle is becoming less and less, I believe, but it's still a nice to have. However, I think the touch function is kind of a good replacement in this camera, at least for now. When it comes to memory cards of the ZF does use 2 card slots, because who would ever buy a camera with 1 card slot, right? But the ZF does use an SD card, and it also uses a micro SD card. So they're not the same type of memory card. They are slightly different. They're different sizes. But for those of you that are really particular about shooting backup and need that ability to use a second card, you have the ability to use micro SD cards and SD cards in the ZF without it sacrificing its size and weight. Obviously, if the ZF was using a CF Express card, then that CF Express card slot does take up a lot of space inside the camera body, so it would have made the camera body much bigger than it actually is. And then when it comes to the battery in the ZF, the battery does use the ENEL15C that you would also find in the Z8, the Z6, the Z7. It does not use the smaller battery of the ZFC, so you do get better battery life than you would against the ZFC, for example. And the battery life for me over the past couple of months has been perfectly fine. I've not noticed it draining particularly quick. I've not used any of the wireless communication options or anything like that. It's actually been just a fairly standard camera for me. Now, when it comes to some of the new things that you'll find in the ZF, some things that you won't find in any Nikon camera up until now, even the Z8 and the Z9, the ZF has one of Nikon's best image stabilization systems to date. The image stabilization system in the Nikon ZF can compensate for up to 8 stops. This is an impressive jump over the 5 stops that you would get out of a Z6 or a Z7, and also an impressive jump out of the 6 stops that you would get out of a Z9 or a Z8 when you're using them with the right lens. So 8 stops is pretty impressive, and the ZF takes this a step further by introducing the ability to link the VR unit to your active focus point. So what this system does is it tunes the stabilization system to stabilize around your focusing point rather than just stabilizing the entire frame around the center of the frame. So if you're focusing over to the left, that'll give you different stabilization than if you are focusing in the center. Nikon doesn't give a specific stops difference to this because obviously there's so many variables with where your focus point is placed and what focal length you're going to be using. That makes a difference to how effective this system is. But by locking your VR to your focus point, it can make quite a big difference, especially if you're using wide-angle lenses. So I see this being something that's used mostly by handheld landscape photographers, those people who want to shoot handheld but might want to shoot a slower shutter speed just to bring a bit of movement into some water somewhere. You should be able to get away with a much slower shutter speed than you would do without this system, and that you would do on an older camera that doesn't have as good of an image stabilization system. The ZF is also the first camera that adds pixel shift. Now, Nikon's official name for this is pixel shift shooting, and it's a menu that's in the camera that allows you to shoot a number of frames, and then you can combine those images into one big image in post-processing. It does not combine those images in camera. The system allows you to shoot the images in camera, choose the number of frames that you want to take, but it does not combine those images in camera. So just something to be aware of. When it comes to pixel shift, there's a couple of different options. You can get the camera to shoot 4, 8, 16 or 32 shots. And depending on the number of shots that you choose, depends on the final effect that you have in your images. 4 and 8 shots will give you better image quality, but they do not give you any higher resolution. And 16 and 32 will give you a higher resolution, and they can also give you better quality as well. When using the 16 or 32 shot options, you can combine them to create approximately a 96 megapixel image. Again, in post, you have to use Nikon software to combine those images together, so just be aware of that. Now, I mentioned earlier about these dials, and these dials on the top of the ZF are made of brass. Now, the idea behind these dials is that the paint will patina over time, and almost like the ZF ages with you. The more that you use it, you lose a bit of paint here on one of the dials, you lose a little bit of paint here on one of the dials, that the ZF then starts to age and starts to show its age, but wearing nicely over time. Now, I could do 2 things here. I could either make a video in 5 or 10 years' time showing you my ZF and showing you how it's managed the test of time, or I could find some sandpaper. So I'm going to forcibly patina the dials and hope that Nikon is okay with that. And as if by magic, here is my forcibly patinaed ZF. I really like it. I actually really like as the brass dials come out on the side here with the grip, where they've got a bit of black paint stuck on the inside of the texture. And then I also really like the fact that the engraved markings on the top of the dials, because they're engraved and the white paint is in the engraving, that white paint still remains. So even though you get rid of the black paint, that white paint still remains, and the brass just feels really nice in the hand as well. Now, at the point that I'm recording this, I've not fully sanded down all of the paint on all three dials. That might change by the time that this camera becomes announced. I might have just gone the whole hog and sanded down every single dial. But for now, I just wanted to see what it looks like. I wanted to see what the brass looks like as it's come through. And I just love that front on profile of just that flash of that brass coming through on those dials. I wish that they did a lens that instead of this silver ring had that same brass ring around it, maybe. But that would be great. That'd be amazing. But even so, as the body itself, I absolutely love the idea that Nikon have gone down this route of using these brass dials, and they know that over time, as that paint marks, as that paint chips, you're just going to start to get these little bits of that bronzy brass start to shine through, and I just love the way that it looks. So I'm really, really happy with that, and I'm probably going to forcibly remove the paint on all of the ZFs that I own or come into contact with, or if Nikon ever do this again. I really like the idea of this. Obviously, I wouldn't recommend doing this to your own cameras. I would use the camera over time, and obviously as that paint starts to wear off over time on these dials, you'll start to get that brass come through. But my main objective was really just to show you guys what it looks like when that paint starts to wear off. And I absolutely love it. I think it should have come from the factory. Well, I mean, why did Nikon even bother painting it? I absolutely love it. Now, there is one noticeable thing that is missing from this camera, and that is that every other mirrorless camera that Nikon have made that has had in-body stabilization, whether that's a Z6, a Z7, Z6 II, Z7 II, whether it's a Z5, whether it's a Z8, whether it's a Z9, they've all had the ability to lock their in-body stabilization system in place. And that's something that I've always been a massive fan of. It means that when the camera's turned off, if it's in a bag, there's just no risk of you damaging that in-body stabilization system. If the camera's dropped or anything like that, there's nothing moving around because it's locked in place. And I've always been a fan of that. However, the ZF does have in-body stabilization, like we talked about earlier, and it's actually very good image stabilization, the best that Nikon's ever made. But it doesn't have a locking mechanism. Now, Nikon's decision around that mechanism is to do with size and weight. It's a shame that they couldn't find a way of fixing a locking mechanism into this camera. So that does mean that the in-body stabilization system does move around when the camera is off, when the camera's not powered. You can hear it moving as you move the camera around, as you shake the camera, you can hear that image stabilization system moving, and you can feel it moving in the camera as well. That's something that never would have happened on a Z6 or a Z7. It just would have been fixed in place. Nikon do say that the reliability and the longevity of the in-body stabilization system is not going to be impacted. It's still going to be just as reliable as you would expect. It's just a shame that they couldn't fit a locking mechanism to the in-body stabilization system in this camera. I've also taken just some simple sample images with this. One thing I would say actually is I do think that Nikon have made a bit of a difference with the X-Speed 7 processor. So in the past, I've never really shot with the 24 megapixel cameras. I would never attest to myself to be a massive Z6 or Z5 user. I've always erred towards Z7s and Z8s. I have used Z6 and Z5 obviously, but I've always had them as maybe a secondary camera, as a backup camera. And so that means that when it comes to image quality of 24 megapixel cameras, I've always generally gone towards the higher megapixel counts, because that's generally just what I prefer. I prefer the higher detail, the resolution, and so on. So I was expecting that the image quality of this camera would be similar to that of a standard 24 megapixel count camera, but I do feel like Nikon have done a little bit of tweaking with the X-Speed 7 processor just to change that profile. The noise performance is obviously a slightly higher ISO than previous, and also the image quality in general. I do believe it is just beyond what you would get from a standard Z6 or Z6 II thanks to the newer processor. So I've actually been really impressed with the image quality that I get out of it. Obviously, though, it is still a 24.5 megapixel count camera. It's not a 45 megapixel camera, so you can't necessarily treat it the same way that you would have treated the Z8 or the Z9 or a Z7, for example. But I think for this particular camera, this style of camera, the 24 megapixel count is actually really nice, and the images it produces are also really nice as well. What do I think about the ZF? What are my final thoughts on this camera? Well, my ZFC has been kind of my go-to me camera. This is the camera that I enjoy shooting with. It's the camera that I always take everywhere with me. I'm not exaggerating. This goes everywhere with me. And I use it an awful lot just to take everyday random pictures of family, friends, whatever it is, right? But now I have that full frame equivalent version of that. Yes, it's a little heavier. Yes, it's a little chunkier, but I still think this is going to be a great camera for me to use and just enjoy the experience of using it. And because of these dials, I really like these dials. Because of these dials, it's just an even better experience for using this camera out there as well. So I've been happy with it. Yes, it's obviously not going to replace a Z8 or a Z9. There are situations where the speed of those cameras and the extra flexibility when it comes to video recording, the extra resolution is going to be a better choice. But if you want something that is full frame, retro styled, well built, I really like the materials in this generally. I really like the ZF, and it's a camera that I'm going to use pretty much every single day just as my own go-to camera. Obviously, when I'm shooting something that's maybe a little bit more demanding, or if I'm shooting wildlife with some of my longer lenses, then I'm going to go back to my Z8 and my Z9, but ZF for me is kind of my everyday camera. If by the time that this video goes live, if I've done any more work to these dials, I'll add in some extra images here just for you to take a look at. And I'll post some stuff on Instagram as well, because as I say, I really like the look of it. I hope that you found this first look video at the ZF useful. If you have any questions about this camera, please do let me know in the comments below. And as always, thank you so much for watching. It really means a lot to me. I'll see you all very soon. It's about to get busy again. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.